Hey all, happy Friday. Well, a few days ago there was a press conference outside the Irish Parliament as they look to opt in to the EU Migration Pact. Now, the EU is really a rerun of the Soviet kind of structure, and it's causing severe issues for nationality and sovereignty across the whole of Europe. So very dangerous times, and here I sat down with Eddie Hobbs at the press conference. We did a live stream, and I'm delighted to bring you the short conversation. We cover much more than the Migration Pact. We cover the whole gamut. Enjoy.
Okay, so my next guest is Ivor, who's an analyst and biochemical engineer, and who was all over COVID from the very first day when that ship, remember the ship that came into Japan? Well, the numbers didn't quite add up. And Ivor, when you get to know him, Ivor's a numbers guy. He just looks at the numbers and lets the numbers do the talking. He's done thousands of podcasts and interviews over the last number of years. He's gone from being a conspiracy theorist branded by the mainstream media to somebody that they now kind of steer clear of, because an awful lot of what he has said has actually come true. And that's why I've invited him to talk to me tonight. And we'll get into the interconnection with the Immigration Pact vote that's going through the Dáil as well in just a moment. So Ivor, thank you so much for coming to talk. Oh. Ivor, I wanted to go back to the very outset. When the vote came in Japan that time, and you're looking at the data, it became quickly apparent to you that there was a complete disconnection between the propaganda that was circulating around and the actual data that was coming through relative to what you taught me at the time, the Gompertz curve, on how viruses work. And that's what got you going, but you've gone deeper and deeper and deeper into the topic and expanded out your analysis as matters have arisen. So that's what I want to catch up on. I want to ask you about how you see the interconnections now compared to what you're looking at at the start of COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely, Eddie. So the Diamond Princess cruise ship was perfect, a Petri ship, as we were calling it at the time. And it was absolutely fantastic in a way. Very sad for the few people who passed. But the people who passed were 7 or 8 people in their late 70s and late 80s. And out of 3,700 people, there were around 2,600, I think, kind of staff, etc. And nothing happened to them. And only a few very aged people passed away, and they might have passed away anyway. So you didn't even need an envelope. You could do it in your head that this has a probable kind of fatality rate, 0.15, 0.2%, which is in the envelope of a severe seasonal flu. And it's clearly highly focused on the very aged, so probably nursing homes will be the biggest target of this disease. And it was quite clear. So when my wife said to me, do we need to get masks? And I said, why, in March? This COVID thing. And I said, but that's nonsense, because I had the data. And it turned out, the funny thing is, with all the data that came out since, the UK had a 0.1% excess mortality in the whole of 2020. And Sweden, with no lockdown and no masks and kids in school, had 0.055. So a half of 0.1%. So the Diamond Princess, in the end, almost overestimated for healthy Western populations. So that was it.
And then when we go on then to the next phase of it, right, which was the emergency use authorized drugs. I find it hard to call them vaccines because they change the definition of a vaccine, as you know, in the middle of it all. Now we're now in 2024, halfway through, and it seems to me that there's just a tsunami of data pouring out now from all over the world on excess deaths, on disability and harm. What are you seeing when you look across all those data sets now emerging?
Yeah, well, actually, Eddie, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that. I leveraged other people in the network. I had my own priorities, more in the geopolitics and the Rockefeller story, which ties all this together, of course. But essentially, the best people out there who are doing the analysis, it's very hard to separate this novel medication, shall we call it, from the effects and the sequelae of lockdowns. So we made a movie, the COVID Chronicles movie.com is where you'll get it. We got a Kickstarter, reasonable budget. And at the end of that movie, I specifically to camera said, there's going to be a freight train of excess mortality coming down the track of us, and it ain't going to last for a season, the flu season. It's going to go on for years, because we knew at the time the psychological torture, the stress imposed on the people, the missed cancer kind of screenings, appointments, the missed cardiac disease. I could go on all day. that's going to cause a freight train of excess mortality in the coming years.
On its own, separate from the vaccines.
Separate. Now, we didn't really get into the vaccine topic too much. That was back in 21. It was a bit early. But the problem now is excess mortality, which we know is there from the vaccine, and even Big Pharma will acknowledge there will be some deaths. It's very hard to separate that out. Probably one of the most telling things, though, is there's a huge excess mortality in younger people, which doesn't fit quite so well with the lockdown stress and the missed screenings. So I think my answer to this is quite simple. I'm going to stay 100% safe and factual as always. The authorities around the world took measures that were utterly useless, whether it's the vaccine or the lockdowns or the masks. The consequence of their measures in total is a huge surge in excess mortality. So we have authorities who, 100% factual, imposed a series of measures that gave no benefit and caused a very large excess mortality and suffering in the people. That's a fact. And if you stick to that, you know you're correct.
Okay. And when you look back the chain now, right, and you see the control of the social media platforms, the cancellation and deplatforming that went on there, well, almost military type precision from what I could see. And then you look at the complete silence, especially in Ireland, of the conventional media, complete silence around the questions of the way the definition of pandemic was changed in 2009, the way the definition of vaccine was changed in the middle of it all, that the injection wouldn't go beyond the site of the injection. Everything we were told turned out to be untrue, largely untrue or entirely untrue. How is all that connected?
Yeah, so the media now, especially since swine flu, so in swine flu they pulled, and it was in the British Medical Journal and JAMA, how the WHO faked a pandemic. That was the title of one paper. So everyone knew they faked a pandemic. They changed the definition of pandemic to take out the severity clause. They did that in a meeting with Big Pharma delegates in Geneva in 2008, before swine flu kicked off. This is all on the record in Der Spiegel and other mainstream newspapers at the time. But what they realized when swine flu collapsed was the media collapses these scams. So they spent 10 to 12 years heavily investing in the media. So all the CEOs of the big media companies now all get their little trips to Davos, World Economic Forum, and the ship is run very tightly. And that's one of the major ways, along with censorship that came from State Department, CIA, military industrial complex. This is all on the record in the Twitter files. All of these efforts worked very well for them. How could you pull off a bad flu equivalent and do what they did in COVID without having control of the media? As Goebbels said, I think it was Goebbels, give me control of the radio or the media and I'll turn any nation into a nation of pigs. So yeah, there's massive control. The big connection, of course, is that I did a root cause diagram on this, and we can put the link later maybe under the tweet. But I show how COVID-19, central bank digital currency, climate change, disaster, propaganda, and indeed the transgender stuff, the crazy stuff, and forced migration, they all form a tapestry of different strategies to get to global government, which I might call an ant farm or a Chinese-style social credit, strong control of the people. And that's what the so-called elite want, from Rockefeller through WEF, Club of Rome, Davos, Bilderberg, State Department, USA, CIA. There's so many parties who are all working together with a vision. And it is a vision. And to them, it's a beautiful vision for a full world government in the West and full control. So that's what ties everything together. And this migration one, just to finish, interestingly, this is not a new concept. Kalergi, back in the 1920s in the Pan-European Union, identified this as a strategy. If you flood the zone of all your nationalist kind of sovereign countries, flood them with very different people, ideally ones who don't kind of integrate well, that's a bonus. What you'll do is you'll just break down those societies and then you'll make them much more amenable to join into a Pan-European Union 100 years ago, or a new world government through the UN, which is today. But it's the same strategy. And it's just amazing to watch it in real life happening.
Were you surprised then by, I mean, they rarely get setbacks, but the major setback was in Geneva on the June weekend when they failed to land the pandemic agreement before they even got there, and then they watered down the regulations. In fact, Article 1 of the regulations, which had taken out the word non-binding 164 times, was reversed. So that's the WHO a little bit set back. But the WHO, the UN now, and the World Economic Forum are the subject of legislative attack by a number of states in the United States. I mean, there seems to me to be, and then Europe has swung a bit to the right from the European elections. It seems to me that there's a bit of a, it's not game, set and match to those that are chasing after 21st century totalitarianism.
No, it's not. And they did so well with COVID, which, to be quite honest, Eddie, I know you said early on in COVID, you kind of went along with the idea that there was a big pandemic. And as I mentioned, I knew from the get-go, not because I'm super smart, but I was very familiar with swine flu, and I knew immediately from Diamond Princess. But the thing is, during COVID, they got away with astonishing amounts of nonsense. It's the word I've used most in the last 4 years for good reasons. They got away with absolute murder, and it was astonishing to me. And after a year of that madness, I thought maybe we're hosed. But absolutely, as you say, there has been a large amount of awakening, and more and more mainstream type players and normies, you might call them, are beginning to realize, hold on a minute, something really, really rotten is going on in the world. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but we had the great result in the referendum. 70% of people effectively through the NGOs and the government and all the other bad people, they threw this referendum back in their faces about removing the family from the Constitution. Now, that 70% of people, they didn't understand what you and I understand about Rockefeller and WEF and all this. They just knew something was stinking. So I think that's what we need, is more and more people to realize something's rotten. I don't want to get conspiracy theorish, but I'm going to start complaining. I'm going to start voting differently. I'm going to start pressuring my school or my politicians, saying the big question I asked in 2020, above all else, why are they doing this? And that's what I think is happening, is people are beginning to say, why are they doing this? Because it makes no sense. It
doesn't, of course, until you join the dots. But I think what will shock a lot of people is that the mentor of Klaus Schwab for 30 years was none other than Peter Sutherland, former Fine Gael Attorney General and the then chairman of Goldman Sachs. He mentored him for 30 years, and he appeared at nearly the same number of Davos meetings. And he was probably the founding father of the capitalist model that the WEF promote, which of course is stakeholder capitalism, which requires you to hollow out national parliaments and beef up the NGOs. Because that's how it's all interconnected, isn't it? I mean, that's the point of connection. But behind all that, those interconnections between the hate speech bill and what's happening in the vote in the Dáil tonight, the bigger agenda, what you're suggesting is the bigger agenda is an attempt to snap together a kind of a one world administration, controlled by the same folk. But that would then require the compliance through fear of the general population. And that's where it's breaking down at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the fear has fallen away. COVID generated a certain amount of fear, but mostly just a dumb, useful idiot compliance, not wanting to be seen as killing granny and all that. So there wasn't a whole lot of true fear, though around 30% of people actually feared it, which is kind of comical. But yeah, this whole, not so much a world government, they'd like that, but really a Western sphere of influence. They'd like to take out Russia and strip mine it for resources. So we're seeing all the last couple of years based on that. But China is unassailable. So China has an ant farm. India and the BRICS countries and Russia are another axis, if you will, that links to China. And then you've got the whole Western sphere, which is what we're talking about. So you'll notice there's no trans nonsense going on over in, the BRICS countries. And during COVID, some of them towed the line, but a lot of them just didn't bother. They paid lip service. So this is a Western thing. They want the UN to be the new world government structure, but really it's a Western thing. And the tensions geopolitically, of course, are with the BRICS countries, China, Russia, India, and all the others joining up, who don't want to be part of this Western ant farm. I mean, they've had a couple of 100 years of colonialism. They don't want a rerun. in fairness.
Well, that's very interesting because I remember a clip of Peter Sutherland addressing the House of Lords in 2012, basically telling him you must have open borders in Europe and you must let everybody in.
That is exactly it. Sutherland, and even the picture you showed in your fantastic talk in Cork of him, you can almost see the evil in his face. So you've got the other mentor of Klaus Schwab, by the way, was, of course, Kissinger for 50 years. And we all know about Kissinger, right? So Sutherland is head of Goldman Sachs. And then suddenly he's in the UN and he's banging on about forced migration. And of course, it's essentially Kalergi again being reapplied in the modern era. He gave a speech where he essentially said that we need to break down nationality and sovereignty in all these European countries. We need to smash it. And the method to do that, clearly inferred in his words, was to flood the zone. Because if you have got these Irish with their, their fiddles and their whiskey and their red hair and all, they're clannish. They've got a culture. They've got a history. They've got something that binds them together as an entity. That's what makes peoples. And you've got the Nordics and they're severe. And then you've got the Germans, But all these people, this is true diversity. You've got all these different countries with very diverse people's cultures, and you can travel between them and appreciate diversity. The irony is the people who scream about diversity are hell-bent on smashing all diversity. So people should think about that. The people telling us we need to be all diverse are actively working round the clock to destroy all diversity, flood the zone of all countries and turn them into just one big blob, bland blob, because they want to rule them.
And control them.
And that's the bottom line. And Sutherland is just a particularly odious, disgusting, kind of reptilian entity. We're not getting into the reptile thing, by the way. These are similes or whatever, metaphors. But a disgusting creature, just like in his own way Klaus is and Kissinger. And just one last thing, Eddie, I'll have to say. Sutherland's head of Goldman Sachs, and suddenly he's in the UN talking about migration. Right? People should kind of cop on and see what's happening here. You also had Maurice Strong way back in the 60s. He's a billionaire, oil billionaire, gets in with the Rockefellers, and suddenly he ends up head of the UN Environmental Division and banging on about global warming. So it's very easy to see the strategies. They're all scams, sadly, but they work with the people because the people increasingly, I think, since World War II have become innumerate. They've become non-scientific. And they've lost a lot of common sense, and they've become a lot more fearful of what society thinks of them. They've become weak. They've kind of become weak, fat and stupid. So sorry, guys, but there you go. Blame processed food or blame these other scumbags. Yeah,
but back in the day, if I recall, based on your research and the research of the people that you've interviewed on your podcast, climate and pandemics were identified from what was for 40 or 50 years ago as the triggers.
In the 50s, it's better documented later, but the 50s into the 60s and exploded in the 70s. There were crisis and opportunities was one of the documents. I think that was the World Future Society with Nelson Rockefeller at the helm. They needed crises that only a world government could fix. So the Rockefellers always said since the 50s, and they looked at the pandemics and health, population explosion and the planet collapsing, peak oil and resources. And the other one, of course, was a climate disaster. These are global issues. And they noted cleverly that the world of science works across borders. It's global. They work on the atom bomb. You have all Jewish guys come from Germany. You have Russians involved. Science crosses borders. Global issues and fixing them crosses all global borders. So we need global hobgoblins if we're going to get a global government. Because the people need to be scared of global issues and need to believe we need a global force to fix them for us, use fear. And that's what they did. They identified.
But isn't that, just to finish on this point, isn't that where we are right now? Because this vote on the asylum, on the Migration and Asylum Pact is precisely the argument the government are making. We can't fix this on our own. We must all get together because it's a European problem. It's not actually, it's a global problem. But you can't be on your own. But Denmark have decided not to opt in.
Absolutely. So the Danes, I think, you know, there's more and more politicians waking up, or I think in many cases, like the Irish referendum, it requires I've always said it, most of our politicians are puppeticians now. They're on the blower to the big guys up top, whether it's Davos or the EU Commission, it doesn't matter. As soon as we vote them in, they learn very quickly who the powers that be are. So it's very hard to go after politicians directly. But if the grassroots are woken up, they will pressure the politicians and we'll see people turning. And I think in Denmark's case, that's something that happened. And even a few good men or women. Sweden had Anders Tegnell and the other guy, I forget his name now, but just a few good people in their health department and a kind of a constitution that did not allow politicians to make decisions on health. All they needed was a few things like that. And they actually didn't do lockdowns, masks, or take children out of school. So we need the people to awaken, and this should help with that, along with everything else. And the people then, when they push back, we've seen in the referendum, we saw with the masking of kids under 10 in Ireland back in 2020, in those dark days, a bunch of parents turned up at Dáil Éireann and they dumped that plan to mask our kiddies, our young kiddies. And that, on the final point I'll add, remember how fundamentally evil these people are, whether it's the banality of evil of the bureaucrats and the useful idiots and the puppeticians, or whether it's the elemental evil of the big players that we mentioned. Either way, I'm not religious at all. People know that. But we're dealing with good versus evil here. Make no mistake about it.
Okay. Ivor Cummins, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you.
That'll do it, folks. And as always, really appreciate anyone who can support the ongoing kind of journalism and technical analysis that I do, getting the correct version of events out there against the torrent of nonsense from the legacy media. So huge thanks to my Patreons and PayPal supporters. We had another fantastic Patreon Zoom last week, and I got out another couple of vlogs with loads of extra content. So anyone who can hop on board, really appreciate it. Thank you.